There are moments in history when one mind changes the rules of everything, when a single person's vision becomes so powerful that it forces the entire world to adapt or perish. This is the story of such a moment, a collision between military genius and absolute power, between innovation and survival, between a German general who revolutionized warfare and a Soviet dictator who learned to defeat him. It's a tale of how fear can forge brilliance, how adaptation becomes its own form of genius, and how their duel created military principles that shape conflicts to this very day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1941 settles over Moscow like a death shroud. In the underground bunkers beneath the Kremlin, where electric lights burn day and night and the air tastes of concrete dust and stale cigarette smoke, Joseph Stalin cannot sleep. The supreme commander of the Soviet Union, the man who commands more soldiers than any leader in human history, sits alone at a mahogany desk, surrounded by captured German military manuals. His hands, those famous hands that have signed death warrants for millions, tremble as they turn the pages. One name appears again and again: Heinz Guderian. Not Adolf Hitler, who rants and gestures for newsreel cameras. Not Hermann Goering, with his medals and morphine addiction. Not even the methodical Erich von Manstein. No, it's Guderian's name that makes Stalin pause, that makes him reach for another cigarette even though he's already smoked 24 today. This quiet Prussian general, this man with wire-rimmed spectacles and thinning hair, has created something that threatens everything Stalin has built. Consider what Stalin sees in his reports. 200 kilometers advanced in a single day, not 200 meters like the grinding warfare of the previous generation. 200 kilometers, entire Soviet armies, hundreds of thousands of men with their tanks and artillery and supply lines simply cease to exist, not destroyed in pitched battles that take weeks. Vanished, encircled before they even know they're under attack, like wolves surrounded by tigers they never heard approaching. The year is 1941, and the German invasion of the Soviet Union is barely 5 months old, yet already 3 million Soviet soldiers are dead, captured, or missing. Stalin's generals describe phenomena that sound like science fiction, tanks moving like cavalry from the Napoleonic era, but faster, covering ground that would have taken horses weeks. Aircraft operating not as a separate air force, dropping bombs from high altitude, but as flying artillery, diving from the sky to destroy specific tanks, specific bridges, specific command posts. Radio coordination that makes 10,000 vehicles move as one organism, responding to conditions faster than any human chain of command could manage. This isn't warfare as Stalin understands it. This is something new, something that makes all his careful preparations, all his purges of the officer corps to ensure loyalty, all his massive tank armies and defensive fortifications, seem as obsolete as swords against machine guns. In his private quarters, where only his most trusted guards are permitted entry, Stalin keeps a photograph. It's not the official propaganda portrait of Guderian in dress uniform. It's a intelligence photograph, grainy and slightly out of focus, showing the German general in the field. Mud on his boots, dust on his leather coat. Standing beside a Panzer Mark III tank, studying a map spread across the vehicle's hull, one finger tracing a route while his staff officers lean in close. Stalin studies this photograph for hours. He's trying to see into the mind of his enemy, to understand how this man thinks. What makes Guderian different, Stalin has. Read every available intelligence report. He knows Guderian's biography the way a hunter knows the habits of his prey. Born in 1888 to a minor Prussian officer's family, fought in the Great War as a signals officer, experiencing the same trench horror as millions of others, rose through the ranks in the tiny army that Germany was permitted after Versailles. Published a book in 1937 called Achtung Panzer, which Stalin has had translated into Russian and has read 3 times. But biography doesn't explain genius. It doesn't explain how this one man has created a form of warfare that conquers nations in weeks when the previous war took 4 years and ended in exhausted stalemate. Stalin understands power. He's held absolute authority over 1/6 of the Earth's land surface for more than a decade. He's orchestrated purges that killed millions, collectivization that starved millions more, industrialization that transformed a peasant nation into a military power. He knows how to make people obey through fear, how to control information, how to eliminate threats before they fully form. But Guderian's power is different. It's not political power enforced by secret police and show trials. It's something more fundamental. It's the power of an idea so compelling that reality itself seems to bend around it. The reports describe impossible things. A panzer division, and Stalin has studied their composition obsessively, knows that each contains approximately 276 tanks, 12,000 men, hundreds of support vehicles, covers 50 kilometers in an afternoon, crosses a river that Soviet engineers swore was impassable for armor, appears behind Soviet defensive lines that were supposed to protect an entire army group. The defenders fire artillery barrages at where the Germans were yesterday, while the actual panzer columns are already 50 kilometers deeper, attacking supply depots and headquarters, creating fire artillery barrages and headquarters, chaos that spreads like poison through the nervous system of command and control. Stalin's military education came from political warfare, from understanding how to manipulate people and organizations. He rose to power through committee meetings and bureaucratic maneuvering, through knowing which rivals to eliminate and which to temporarily ally with. He purged most of his experienced officers in 1937 and 1938, executing or imprisoning 30,000 military leaders because he feared they might threaten his political power. Now, facing Guderian's panzers, he wonders if that purge was the greatest mistake of his life. The few surviving competent generals try to explain modern warfare to him. They use terms like Schwerpunkt, German for point of main effort, and Auftragstaktik mission-type orders, where junior officers are given objectives and trusted to achieve them however they see fit. They describe how Guderian's tanks don't attack everywhere equally. They probe defenses until they find a weak point, then concentrate overwhelming force at that single location, breaking through. Then instead of stopping to consolidate like traditional military doctrine demands, they keep going. They drive deep into enemy rear areas, bypassing strong points, attacking supply lines and command posts and artillery positions, creating panic and paralysis. Like floodwater finding the lowest ground, one general explains, standing before a massive wall map in the command bunker. They flow around obstacles. By the time we rush reserves to block them, they've already flooded past. Stalin listens. He smokes. He says nothing. But his mind is working with the same calculating intensity he applied to political survival during Lenin's final years, during the power struggles with Trotsky and Bukharin and the others he eventually destroyed. There's a pattern here, a method. Guderian isn't simply lucky or reckless. This is a system. And systems can be understood. Systems can be countered. Late at night, when the reports stop coming and the bunker falls into relative quiet, Stalin walks to the map table. Colored pins mark German positions, Soviet positions, the locations of destroyed divisions, red for Soviet forces, black for German. The black pins push deeper each day, like a disease spreading across the body of the motherland. He traces the routes of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group with his finger, from the Polish border across the Bialystok pocket where 300,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded in the first week, through Minsk, which fell faster than Stalin thought physically possible, toward Smolensk, toward the road to Moscow, 700 kilometers, in 3 weeks. Napoleon's cavalry needed months to cover that distance, and they were considered the fastest military force in history until Guderian came along. Stalin returns to his desk, to the captured German manuals, to his photographs and intelligence reports. He's transforming, evolving under pressure. The political animal who rose through betrayal and committee manipulation is becoming something else, a student of military science, learning from the very enemy trying to destroy him. This is natural selection, operating at the level of empires. Adapt or die. Learn from your predator or be consumed by it. And Stalin, whatever else history will say about him, is a survivor. He's survived Lenin, survived Trotsky, survived the Civil War and the collectivization crisis, and the purges, and his own paranoia made manifest in violence. Now he faces his greatest test, a form of warfare that moves faster than information, that creates disasters before defenders can respond, that makes traditional military thinking as obsolete as muskets. In his notebooks, these will be discovered decades later, carefully preserved, despite his orders that all personal papers be destroyed after his death. Stalin begins sketching tank formations, defensive positions, calculations of how long it takes different types of units to redeploy, the depth of defenses needed to slow a panzer thrust by various amounts of time, the ratio of anti-tank guns to frontage. He's not just reacting anymore, he's beginning to think like Guderian thinks, to see warfare not as static positions and frontal assaults, but as flows and concentrations, as speed and surprise, as the exploitation of temporary advantages before the enemy can respond. The ghost in Stalin's war room isn't just Guderian's military success. It's something deeper. It's the realization that someone out there has figured out a more fundamental truth about warfare, about violence, about how military force actually works in the modern age. And that truth is eating the Soviet Union alive. 3 million men gone in 5 months, industrial cities occupied, millions of civilians fleeing eastward in panic. And winter is coming, yes, but Stalin knows even if Hitler doesn't seem to, that winter alone won't save them. Not against this, not against a tactical system that operates inside the decision-making cycle of traditional military responses. Stalin looks again at the photograph of Guderian studying his map. He memorizes the face, the posture, the focus. Know your enemy, Lenin taught him. Know what drives them, what they want, how they think. And so, in the deepest winter of the war, in the underground bunkers where daylight never penetrates, and the fate of nations is decided by tired men moving pins on maps, a strange relationship forms. Not friendship. How could there be friendship across a war that will kill 27 million Soviet citizens before it ends? Not even respect, exactly, though that will come later. No, this is something more primal. This is the relationship between predator and prey, between innovation and survival, between the general who has revolutionized warfare and the dictator who must learn to defeat that revolution or watch everything he's built collapse into ruin. The ghost in Stalin's war room has a name, a face, a tactical system that threatens to redraw the map of the world. And the only way to exorcise that ghost is to understand it so completely that its advantages become vulnerabilities, its strengths become predictable patterns that can be countered. This is where our story truly begins, in that moment of recognition, when Stalin realizes he must become his enemy's student before he can become his conqueror. To understand how Heinz Guderian created the tactical system that would terrify Stalin, we must travel backward in time, to a place where the very concept of movement in warfare had died. We must go to Verdun, to the muddy hell of 1916, where a young signals officer named Guderian watched the future of warfare being murdered by the past. Picture it, the longest battle in human history, 300 days of continuous artillery bombardment, shells falling at a rate of 100,000 per day at the battle's peak. The ground itself transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters, where the remains of previous battles, equipment, fortifications, bodies are blown up, buried, and blown up again in an endless cycle of destruction. Heinz Guderian is 28 years old, a captain in the German Army's Signals Corps, responsible for maintaining telephone communications between headquarters and the front lines. It's a job that requires him to understand the geography of the battlefield intimately, to know where every division is positioned, to trace the flow of information that supposedly allows generals to command their armies. Except nothing flows at Verdun. Everything is stuck, frozen, dying in place. He walks through the communications trenches, the relatively safer passages behind the front lines, where soldiers move supplies and reinforcements forward. Even here, supposedly protected, shells land randomly. A man beside him is speaking one. A moment, simply gone the next, vaporized by a direct hit from a French artillery shell. No time to mourn. The telephone lines need repair. Messages must get through. Guderian climbs what's left of a stone wall, part of a farmhouse that existed before the battle turned this valley into an abattoir, and looks toward the front lines 3 kilometers away. What he sees will haunt him for the rest of his life, and change military history forever. The French are attacking. Waves of men in horizon blue uniforms climbing out of trenches, advancing across open ground toward German machine gun positions. The machine guns open fire. Men fall like wheat before a scythe. The survivors reach the German wire kilometers of barbed wire obstacles, rusted red with old blood, and try to cut through while bullets strike around them. Artillery from both sides falls on the same patch of ground, killing attackers and defenders indiscriminately. In 6 hours of fighting, the French advance 100 meters. 100 meters purchased with 5,000 lives. Tomorrow the Germans will counterattack and take those 100 meters back, losing another 5,000 men in the process. This is modern warfare in 1916. This is what happens when defensive technology, machine guns, barbed wire, artillery that can fire 20 kilometers with reasonable accuracy, has advanced beyond offensive capability. Attackers are slaughtered. Defenders hunker behind concrete and steel and survive until they become attackers and are slaughtered in turn. By the time the Battle of Verdun ends, 306,000 men will be dead. Another 500,000 wounded. For what? The front lines will have moved less than 10 kilometers in total. France and Germany will have fed an entire generation of young men into a meat grinder that produced nothing but grief. Guderian returns to his dugout, a reinforced cellar beneath a destroyed building, where signal officers maintain the tenuous connection between generals and their armies, and something breaks inside him. Not his courage or his sanity, but his belief that warfare should continue this way. There must be another way. There must be. The thought becomes obsession, movement. That's what's missing. In the old warfare, before trenches and machine guns, armies moved. Cavalry swept around flanks. Infantry maneuvered to find weak points. Generals adapted their plans based on changing conditions. But here at Verdun, everyone is paralyzed, locked into positions because leaving them means death. What if you could make defense vulnerable again? What if you could move faster than machine guns could be repositioned? What if you could penetrate deep enough that you reach the artillery positions, the supply depots, the headquarters, where generals tried to coordinate the chaos? The Great War ends in November 1918. Germany loses. The Treaty of Versailles strips Germany's military to almost nothing. A tiny army of 100,000 men, forbidden from having tanks, forbidden from having an air force, forbidden from having more than a handful of artillery pieces. It's meant to ensure Germany can never threaten its neighbors again. Instead, it creates opportunity. Guderian is now a captain in this skeleton army, the Reichswehr. Because the army is so small, every officer is valuable. There's no room for the incompetent or the merely average. You must be excellent, or you're removed. This forced selection pressure creates one of the most professional military forces in history. Small, but thinking constantly about how to be effective despite restrictions. And those restrictions don't apply everywhere. Deep in Soviet Russia, in a place called Kama, far from Western eyes, a secret arrangement exists. The Soviets have vast empty spaces where they can test equipment. The Germans have expertise and officers who need training. In 1926, Guderian travels this facility, traveling under a false name, in civilian clothes, on a mission that officially doesn't exist. Here, on Soviet soil, ironically learning on the very ground he will one day invade, Guderian experiments with tanks. They're primitive machines, these early tanks, unreliable, slow. The engines break down constantly. The armor is thin enough that heavy machine gun bullets can penetrate it. They get stuck in mud, overheat in summer, freeze in winter. Most military theorists dismiss them as interesting failures, useful perhaps for supporting infantry attacks, but not capable of independent action. Guderian sees something different. He sees potential. Watch him at Kama, a thin figure in tankers' coveralls, climbing in and out of vehicles, timing how long it takes to change a broken track, calculating fuel consumption, testing how far a tank can travel before crew fatigue reduces effectiveness. He's not thinking about tanks as mobile fortresses. He's thinking about them as the solution to the problem of Verdun. How fast can they move? 40 kilometers per hour on roads, perhaps 20 cross-country with good terrain. That's faster than infantry can march, faster than horse cavalry can sustain, Fast enough to penetrate deeply before enemy reserves arrive. How much firepower can they deliver? Each tank has a cannon and machine guns. A battalion of tanks' 50 vehicles can deliver more firepower than an entire infantry regiment, while being immune to small arms fire and shell fragments. How do you coordinate them? This is the crucial question. Radios. Put radios in every tank. Let commanders communicate instantly, adapt to conditions, concentrate forces without needing runners or telephone lines that are always getting cut by artillery. The pieces come together in Guderian's mind like a mathematical proof. Speed plus firepower plus communication equals mobility, and mobility is what died at Verdun. Mobility is what must be reborn. He returns to Germany in 1930 and begins writing, teaching, advocating. He gives lectures at the military academy, standing before rooms of skeptical senior officers, explaining his vision. Most dismiss him. Tanks are too unreliable, they say, too expensive, too vulnerable. The infantry is the queen of battle, and tanks should support infantry attacks, not operate independently. But Guderian is stubborn. That quiet Prussian persistence, that refusal to accept the conventional wisdom, keeps him pushing. He publishes articles in military journals. He cultivates supporters among younger officers who remember Verdun's horror and want something better. He writes his book, Achtung Panzer, laying out the complete theory. Then Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933, and everything changes. Hitler doesn't understand military tactics. He's a former corporal who served in the trenches and understands warfare at the level of small unit actions. But he does understand politics and perception. He's watched newsreels of tanks in training exercises, seen how impressive they look, how modern and powerful. And Hitler is obsessed with projecting power. When Guderian requests funding to create the first real panzer divisions, armoured divisions capable of independent operations, Hitler approves. Not because he grasps the tactical theory, because tanks look impressive in parades. 1935. The first panzer division forms. Guderian commands it personally. 276 tanks, 12,000 men. But it's not just tanks. That's the crucial insight that sets Guderian apart from every other tank theorist of his era. Each panzer division includes motorized infantry, riding in trucks and half-tracks, capable of keeping pace with the tanks. Engineers with portable bridges to cross rivers, artillery mounted on tracked vehicles, anti-aircraft guns to protect against enemy air attack, intelligence units, supply columns with fuel and ammunition, medical services, everything an independent combat unit needs, all mobile, all capable of moving together at speed, and binding it all together, radios. Not just in command vehicles, but in every tank. Every company commander can talk to his battalion commander, every battalion commander to the division commander. Information flows instantly. Orders adapt to reality in minutes, not hours. Guderian tests the system relentlessly. Training exercises where panzer divisions race across Germany, covering hundreds of kilometers, coordinating with Luftwaffe dive bombers who practice providing close air support. He identifies problems and fixes them. The tanks break down too often, develop better maintenance procedures, crews get fatigued, determine optimal rotation schedules, supply columns can't keep up, design faster trucks and pre-position fuel depots. It's like watching evolution in fast forward. Each exercise is a generation. Weak elements are eliminated. Successful adaptations are retained and spread throughout the force. The Panzer Division evolves from concept to reality, from theory to a practical weapon system that works. The Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1936. Germany sends tanks to support Franco's nationalists. Guderian doesn't go, he's too valuable to risk, but he devours every report. Soviet tanks face German tanks. Italian tanks fight alongside German infantry. It's a laboratory for testing theories. The results confirm Guderian's vision. Tanks used in small groups, supporting infantry, achieve modest success, but tanks concentrated in mass, operating independently, break through enemy lines and create chaos in rear areas. The pattern repeats again and again. Concentration defeats dispersion. Speed defeats static defense. Initiative defeats reaction. By 1939, Germany has 6 panzer divisions. Guderian commands a panzer corps, 2 divisions plus supporting units, over 60,000 men and 600 tanks. They've trained together for years. The commanders know each other, trust each other, understand the system at an instinctive level. The final element falls into place: integration with the Luftwaffe. Guderian works personally with Air Force commanders, developing procedures for close air support. Ju-87. Stuka dive bombers become flying artillery, able to strike targets that ground forces identify, responding in minutes instead of the hours traditional artillery requires for coordination. The dive bombers serve another purpose: psychological warfare. The Stukas have sirens mounted on their landing gear, producing a screaming wail as they dive. It's terrifying, demoralizing, creating panic even among troops who aren't directly hit. The physical destruction is real, but the psychological impact is even more valuable. Defenders break and flee, abandoning positions that might have held. Imagine the complete system now. A panzer division on the move. The tanks advance in a column, covering ground quickly. Scouts in light tanks range ahead, probing for enemy positions. When they encounter resistance, they don't attack directly, they report back. The division commander, riding in a tank, equipped with multiple radios, able to communicate with his units and with supporting forces, assesses the situation. Is this a weak point? Concentrate the tanks. Bring up the motorized infantry. Call in the Stukas. Smash through with overwhelming force at one location. Break through, keep moving. The breakthrough units don't stop to fight enemy strongpoints that they've bypassed. They drive past, attacking headquarters, supply depots, artillery positions, creating chaos that paralyzes enemy command and control. Is this a strong point? Don't attack it. Bypass it. Move around. Leave it for follow-on infantry divisions to deal with later. The Panzer Division's job isn't to conquer territory. It's to maintain momentum, to keep the enemy off balance, to prevent any coherent defense from forming. This is blitzkrieg lightning war, though Guderian himself never particularly likes that term. It's too flashy, too much emphasis on speed alone. What he's created is something more sophisticated, a system for conducting warfare inside the enemy's decision-making cycle. Act faster than they can react. Create crises faster than they can resolve them. Maintain initiative absolutely, never letting the enemy recover balance. The mathematics of it become clear. In traditional warfare, attackers need a 3-to-1 advantage to overcome entrenched defenders. But Guderian's system doesn't attack entrenchments. It bypasses them, making them irrelevant. A panzer division can defeat forces 10 times its size by never fighting on the enemy's terms, never allowing a static battle to develop. It's elegant, brutal, revolutionary, and in 1939, the world is about to learn what happens when theory becomes reality, when the system that grew from one man's horror at Verdun is unleashed against nations still thinking about warfare in the old way. Stalin, preparing the Soviet Union for eventual war with Germany, has no idea what's coming. His tanks are more numerous than Germany's, his army is larger, his industrial capacity is growing rapidly. By traditional calculations, the Soviet Union should be able to defend itself, perhaps even win if war comes. But Stalin is calculating using the old mathematics, the mathematics of 1916, of Verdun, where numbers and positions determined victory. He hasn't yet encountered the new mathematics, where speed and initiative and the systematic exploitation of temporary advantages render traditional numerical superiority meaningless. That education is coming. The teacher's name is Heinz Guderian, and the tuition will be paid in blood across the vast spaces of Eastern Europe. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, supposedly on a courtesy visit to the Polish port of Danzig, opens fire on Polish fortifications at point-blank range. Simultaneously, along an 1,800-kilometre front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains, German forces cross into Poland. Heinz Guderian's 19th Corps, 2 panzer divisions plus supporting units, advances from East Prussia toward the Polish corridor. This is it. This is the moment when theory meets reality, when years of training and development face the ultimate test of actual combat. The Polish army is not weak. Over 1 million men under arms, cavalry traditions going back centuries, brave soldiers prepared to defend their homeland. Their military planning is based on the last war, on the assumption that modern warfare looks like 1914 through 1918. They expect a slower, more methodical advance. They plan to trade space for time, falling back to defensive lines, while allies in France and Britain mobilize and attack Germany from the west. They have 3 weeks, maybe a month before they need to seriously worry. That's how long military campaigns take. That's what every war college in the world teaches. Guderian's panzers cover 140 kilometers in the first 3 days. Polish commanders stare at their maps in disbelief. The reports can't be accurate. German tanks can't possibly be that deep already. There must be errors in reconnaissance, confusion in the chaos of initial combat. They dispatch reserves to block what they think is a limited breakthrough, expecting to find a few battalions that have pushed ahead recklessly and can be cut off and destroyed. Instead, they find 2 complete panzer divisions, with air support, artillery, infantry, engineers, everything. Organized, coordinated, already pushing deeper. Guderian doesn't sleep. He's at the front constantly, in his command tank or in requisitioned vehicles, driving forward to see conditions personally. When his superiors radio orders to slow down, to wait for infantry divisions to catch up and secure his flanks, he ignores them. Sometimes, literally, he orders his radio operator to report technical difficulties, buying hours of time before responding to increasingly frantic calls from headquarters. This infuriates his superiors. It violates every principle of proper military command. You don't simply disconnect your radio when high command tries to contact you. You don't advance beyond what supply lines can support. You don't leave your flanks exposed to potential counterattack. But Guderian understands something they don't. In this new form of warfare, speed is security. The faster you move, the less time the enemy has to organize a response. The deeper you penetrate, the more chaos you create in their rear areas, preventing them from mounting effective counterattacks against your exposed flanks. It's counterintuitive, it violates common sense. But it works. The Polish city of Brest-Litovsk, a fortress city that held out for months against German attacks in the previous war, falls in 3 days. The Polish Pomorza army, defending the corridor between Germany and East Prussia, ceases to exist as an organized force in less than a week, not defeated in pitched battle. Simply enveloped, surrounded, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, then systematically destroyed by following infantry divisions while the panzers race onward. September 17th. The Soviet Union invades Poland from the east, honoring the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that divided Poland between Germany and Russia. German and Soviet forces meet near Brest-Litovsk. Guderian personally participates in the joint victory parade with Soviet officers, shaking hands, smiling for cameras. It's a strange moment, pregnant with future meaning. The German general whose tactics will nearly destroy the Soviet Union, meeting with Soviet commanders who will eventually help defeat him, both celebrating the conquest of Poland. If anyone at that parade could see even 2 years into the future, they would understand the bitter irony. September 27. Warsaw surrenders. The campaign has lasted 27 days. 27 days to conquer a nation of 35 million people, defended by a 1 million-man army. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin watches and learns. His intelligence services have reported everything. The speed of German advances, the coordination between tanks, aircraft and infantry, the systematic bypassing of strong points, the creation of chaos through deep penetration. Soviet observers were embedded with Polish units, seeing firsthand how blitzkrieg operates. Stalin orders a complete analysis. He wants to know exactly how many tanks Guderian used, what types, what formations, how fast they moved, how much fuel they consumed, everything. He's treating this like an intelligence problem to be solved through data collection and analysis. But there's something else happening, something more personal. Stalin is becoming fascinated with Guderian specifically. Not just with German military tactics in general, but with this particular man. He creates a special intelligence unit. Later documents will reveal its codename as Operation Spotlight, dedicated solely to tracking Guderian's movements, where he commands, what his typical tactics are, how he thinks, what makes him different from other German commanders. The reports accumulate. Guderian always attacks at dawn, always at the junction between enemy units, where coordination is weakest, always deeper than anyone thinks possible. He treats fuel and ammunition as the limiting factors in advance, not enemy resistance, planning his operations around when his tanks will run out of gas, not when the enemy might stop him. Stalin begins to see patterns. This isn't random. Guderian has a system, a method, and methods can be studied. Patterns can be predicted. May 10th, 1940. Germany invades France and the Low Countries. Guderian commands the 19th Panzer Corps, 3 divisions now, over 60,000 men. His objective is the Ardennes forest, considered impassable for armour by French military planners. Dense woods, rough terrain, narrow roads, perfect defensive ground. The French have left it lightly defended, certain that no serious attack can come through there. Guderian's 3 divisions squeeze through the Ardennes in 3 days, emerging at Sedan on the Meuse River. This is the critical moment. Cross the Meuse, break through the French fortified line beyond it, and the road to Paris lies open. Fail, and the entire German offensive bogs down. May 13th. 4 in the afternoon. After hours of air bombardment and artillery preparation, German infantry in rubber boats begin crossing the Meuse River. They paddle frantically through French machine gun and artillery fire. Many boats are sunk, men drown or are shot in the water, but enough make it across to establish a small bridgehead. Guderian orders engineers forward to construct a pontoon bridge. By midnight, it's complete. Tanks begin rolling across, a thin stream of armour trickling into the tiny bridgehead on the far shore. Dawn on May 14th, French reserves are rushing towards Sedan to seal the breach. If they arrive in force before enough German tanks cross, they'll destroy the bridgehead and end the offensive. Every hour matters. Every minute matters. Guderian's superiors order him to wait, consolidate. Don't push forward until more divisions cross and secure the bridgehead properly. It's the sensible thing to do. The safe thing. Guderian literally disconnects his radio, orders his staff to report that they're having technical difficulties, and drives his exhausted crews forward. The lead elements of his panzer divisions burst through the French defensive line and race westward across open country. There are no continuous trenches here, no fortified positions, every few kilometres like in the previous war. Just scattered French units, supply depots, headquarters compounds, artillery positions, all established, assuming the front line is far to the east, where it was yesterday. The panzers roll through this rear area like sharks through a school of fish, not stopping to fight, just destroying everything in their path and moving onward. Supply trucks blown apart, command posts overrun, artillery batteries captured before they can fire a shot, communications nodes eliminated. The French military command structure begins to collapse. Generals can't reach their units. Units can't reach each other. Reports coming in are hours old by the time they're received, describing situations that have already changed completely. Orders sent to divisions arrive at headquarters that have already been overrun. In 6 weeks, France falls. France. The nation that withstood 4 years of German attacks in the previous war. The nation with the largest army in Europe, with massive fortifications, with British support, conquered in 6 weeks. The official surrender is signed on June 22, 1940, in the same railway car where Germany signed its surrender in November 1918. Hitler choreographs it deliberately as revenge and humiliation. But Stalin isn't focused on Hitler's theatrics. He's focused on Guderian's achievement. One man, one tactical system, has rewritten the rules of warfare and proven it by defeating the 2 most powerful militaries in Europe in a combined total of 9 weeks. Stalin's obsession deepens. He keeps files now, detailed dossiers on every senior German commander, but Guderian's file is thickest. Photographs, translated excerpts from captured German military journals, analysis of every battle he's fought, attempts to model his decision-making process. There's a story unconfirmed but repeated in multiple sources after Stalin's death that he had a large portrait of Guderian in his private study, not on public display but where he could see it while working. When asked by a close aide why he kept a picture of a German general, Stalin supposedly replied, "Know your enemy, especially when your enemy teaches you." The Soviet military begins adapting. Stalin orders development of new tank designs, more armor, better guns, greater reliability. He demands improvements in radio communication, having seen how crucial it was to German success. He mandates training exercises emphasizing mobility and coordination between different combat arms. But there's a problem, a fundamental problem that Stalin can't easily fix. The purges of 1937 and 1938 killed most of the Soviet Union's experienced military commanders. 30,000 officers executed or imprisoned, including 90% of all generals and 80% of all colonels. Stalin did this deliberately, fearing that the military might threaten his political power. Now he needs those officers desperately. He needs experienced commanders who can think independently, who can adapt to changing battlefield conditions, who can exercise the kind of initiative that Guderian's system requires. But initiative is dangerous in Stalin's Soviet Union. Officers who think for themselves might question orders, might become political threats. The entire structure of Soviet governance is built on obedience, on following directives from above, on the assumption that Stalin and the party know best and must never be contradicted. Guderian's system requires the opposite. It requires junior officers to make decisions instantly based on local conditions, to take risks, to sometimes disobey orders when those orders are based on outdated information. This is the fundamental tension that Stalin can't resolve. To defeat Guderian, he needs officers like Guderian. But officers like Guderian are exactly the type who threaten authoritarian control. So Stalin does what he can. He releases some imprisoned officers from the gulags. He promotes younger commanders who show promise. He authorizes expanded production of tanks and aircraft. He begins construction of defensive works along the western border. And he watches, he studies, he learns. German intelligence notices this, of course. They report to Hitler that Stalin seems personally fascinated with Guderian. Hitler, who doesn't understand the deeper implications, jokes about it. "The Georgian bandit has good taste in generals," he says. But it's not a joke. It's natural selection operating in real time. Stalin is adapting to Guderian's threat the way prey species adapt to new predators, through observation, through analysis, through desperate innovation driven by survival instinct. The pattern is ancient. It appears throughout nature. A predator develops a new hunting technique. Prey that cannot adapt go extinct. Prey that can adapt, survive, and evolve counter-strategies. The predator then must adapt to the new defenses. Back and forth, action and reaction, in an endless arms race driven by the simple mathematics of survival. Guderian has introduced a new form of warfare that gives Germany overwhelming advantage. But that advantage isn't permanent. It can only last until opponents learn to counter it. And Stalin, whatever else he may be, is learning. The question is, will he learn fast enough? Germany's industrial capacity is limited. The Wehrmacht can't sustain large-scale warfare indefinitely without conquering new territory for resources. Hitler has already decided that the Soviet Union must be invaded, its oil fields captured, its industrial capacity destroyed before it can fully modernize and rearm. The clock is ticking. For Germany, time is running out to use the advantage that Guderian has created. For the Soviet Union, time is running out to develop the counters that might allow survival. And in Moscow, in his private quarters, Stalin continues his midnight studies, maps, spread across his desk, reports from intelligence services, captured German tactical manuals, all focused on understanding one man and the system he created. The predator has arrived. The prey has recognized its danger. Now begins the desperate race between innovation and adaptation, between the general who revolutionized warfare and the dictator who must learn to defeat that revolution or watch his empire collapse. This is not a story about good versus evil. Both men serve monstrous regimes that will kill tens of millions before this war ends. This is a story about the logic of military evolution, about how tactical genius forces counter innovation, about the endless cycle where every advantage creates pressure for new defenses and every defense creates pressure for new offenses. The stage is set. The pieces are moving into position. And the greatest test of both men of the moment when Guderian's perfected system meets Stalin's desperate adaptations is barely a year away. June 22nd, 1941, 4 in the morning. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,000 aircraft cross into Soviet territory along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It's the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa has begun. Heinz Guderian commands 2nd Panzer Group over 3,000 vehicles, including 700 tanks, organized into 5 divisions. His objective is straightforward and terrifying. Race toward Moscow. Cover the 700 kilometers from the Polish border to the Soviet capital before winter arrives. Destroy every Soviet army that stands in the way. The first week is a nightmare for the Soviet defenders. Not because they don't fight. Soviet soldiers are brave, often fanatically so, but because they're fighting the previous war while Guderian is fighting the next one. Soviet units are deployed forward, right at the border, exactly where military doctrine from the previous war says they should be. Dense concentrations of troops and tanks, ready to repel invasions, but dense concentrations are exactly what Blitzkrieg destroys best. The German advance isolates these forward units, surrounds them, and moves past while they're still trying to establish defensive positions. Bialystok pocket. 324,000 Soviet soldiers encircled in the first week. They fight desperately, trying to break out, but Guderian's panzers have already moved on, 200 kilometers deeper, attacking the next line of defense before it can fully form. Stalin, in Moscow, receives reports that read like fiction. His entire Western Front, the Soviet military formation responsible for defending the direct route to Moscow, has essentially ceased to exist. Over 600,000 men killed, captured, or encircled. 3,000 tanks destroyed or captured. All in 3 weeks. He executes the commanding general, orders the formation of new armies, demands that his remaining forces stand and fight. No retreat under any circumstances. This is standard. Stalin responded to crisis with purges and impossible orders backed by threats of execution. But something else happens. Something unexpected. Stalin begins implementing the adaptations he's been developing during his 2 years of studying Guderian. At Smolensk, in July 1941, the Soviet defense changes. Instead of single defensive lines that can be penetrated and bypassed, the Soviets create defense in depth. 3 separate defensive belts, each 10 to 15 kilometers deep. When German panzers break through the first belt, they find another behind it, and another behind that. Guderian's advance slows. Not stops, nothing stops the panzers yet, but slows. Instead of covering 50 kilometers per day, they're covering 20. Instead of achieving breakthrough in hours, it takes days. This is Stalin's first successful counter-adaptation. He can't match German speed or coordination yet, but he can use space. The Soviet Union has depth that France didn't have. He can trade kilometers for time, build new defensive positions while the Germans are still fighting through old ones. The battle for Smolensk lasts 2 months. Soviet losses are catastrophic. Another 300,000 men encircled, entire armies destroyed. But they accomplish something crucial. They delay Guderian. Every day spent fighting at Smolensk is a day not spent advancing toward Moscow. Every week is a week closer to winter. Guderian rages at the delay. He knows, intellectually understands with absolute clarity, that time is his enemy now. His panzers are wearing out. Mechanical breakdowns increase daily. Supply lines stretch longer and longer, making it harder to bring forward fuel and ammunition, and summer is ending. He pleads with his superiors to let him bypass Smolensk, to leave it for follow-on forces while he races toward Moscow. But Hitler intervenes, ordering the panzers to turn south instead, to encircle Soviet forces in Ukraine. It's a sound strategic decision, destroying more Soviet armies, capturing vital industrial regions. But it costs time. By the time Guderian's panzers finally turn toward Moscow in September, the window is closing. Stalin uses every day of delay. In the Ural Mountains, far from the front lines, Soviet industry evacuates. Entire factories are disassembled, loaded onto trains, moved 1,000 kilometers east, and reassembled. It's a logistical miracle born of desperation. Stalin personally oversees the evacuation, working 20-hour days, making decisions about which industries to save and which to abandon. And he's learning, studying every battle, every engagement. Soviet commanders who show initiative, who adapt successfully to German tactics, are promoted rapidly. Commanders who stick rigidly to doctrine are relieved or shot. It's brutal natural selection, operating at institutional scale. The Soviets start creating specialized anti-tank units, not just anti-tank guns defending static positions, but mobile hunter-killer teams that infiltrate German rear areas and attack supply columns. They learn to let the panzers pass, then attack the softer support vehicles following behind, cut the supply lines, and even Guderian's tanks become helpless. Soviet artillery develops new tactics. Instead of trying to hit fast-moving German tanks, they create fire bags, pre-registered kill zones, where every gun in a sector can concentrate fire instantly. When German armor enters these zones, they face overwhelming fire from multiple directions. It's not elegant like German coordination. It's cruder, more brutal, but it works. Soviet casualties remain horrific. Sometimes 10 Soviet soldiers die for every German killed, but the advance is slow. The mathematics of attrition begin to favor the defender. October 1941. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group reaches Orel, just 300 kilometers from Moscow. They've covered 700 kilometers from the Polish border, destroyed or captured over 2 million Soviet soldiers, annihilated entire armies. But the costs are accumulating. Guderian's panzer divisions, which started with 700 tanks, now have fewer than 300 operational. The rest are broken down, out of fuel, or destroyed. The crews are exhausted, fighting continuously for 4 months, sleeping in vehicles, living on captured Soviet rations supplemented by whatever German supply trucks can deliver. And then the weather changes. Late October brings rain. The dirt roads of Russia, barely roads at all by Western European standards, turn to mud. Not ordinary mud. A special Russian mud called Rasputitsa, thick as glue, that can swallow trucks up to their axles. Panzer divisions that covered 50 kilometers per day now struggle to advance 10. November brings snow, then bitter cold. Temperatures dropping to -20, -30 degrees Celsius. German tanks won't start because their engines freeze. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms because the high command assumed the war would be over by now, begin suffering frostbite and hypothermia. Soviet soldiers, equipped for winter, begin counterattacking. Not yet strong enough for major offensives, but probing attacks, testing German defenses, looking for weaknesses. Guderian requests permission to halt the advance, to establish winter defensive positions, to rest and refit his forces. Hitler refuses. Moscow is so close. Push forward. Take the capital before winter fully sets in. The final German offensive toward Moscow begins in mid-November. It's a shadow of the force that crossed the border in June. The panzers advance through snow and ice, fighting for every kilometer. Soviet resistance stiffens. Fresh divisions from Siberia, troops trained for winter warfare, equipped with skis and white camouflage, arrive at the front. December 5th, 1941. The thermometer reads -35 degrees Celsius. German reconnaissance units can see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance. They are within 30 kilometers of Moscow's city limits. Closer than any invading army has come since Napoleon in 1812. And then the Soviet counteroffensive begins. 100 divisions, over 1 million fresh troops. Soviet commanders implementing everything Stalin has taught them over 5 months of desperate learning. They don't try to match German mobility, they can't, not yet. Instead, they attack in waves, overwhelming exhausted German units through sheer mass and winter expertise. Guderian's panzers, frozen in place by cold and lack of fuel, cannot maneuver. The tactical system that conquered Poland and France and drove 700 kilometers into Russia suddenly becomes irrelevant when vehicles won't move and men can't fight effectively in -40-degree cold. For the first time in the war, German forces retreat, not tactical withdrawals, actual retreats, abandoning positions, losing equipment, scrambling to avoid encirclement. Stalin, in his underground command bunker, allows himself a grim smile. The predator has been stopped. Not defeated. The cost is too high. Too many Soviet dead, but stopped. The system that seemed invincible has encountered conditions where it cannot function. This is the moment where student begins to surpass teacher, where the prey's adaptations finally match the predator's advantages. The mathematics of warfare are shifting. German tactical superiority still exists, but Soviet strategic depth, industrial capacity, and willingness to accept massive casualties are beginning to matter more. The Battle of Moscow continues through January 1942, with both sides exhausted, before stabilizing into winter stalemate. Guderian is relieved of command. Hitler's rage at the failure to take Moscow needs a scapegoat. The general who revolutionized warfare is sent home in disgrace. But his legacy remains. He's taught Stalin how modern warfare works, and in teaching his enemy, he's ensured that enemy can adapt, can learn, can develop counters. The collision of titans has occurred. Neither side has won decisively, but the trajectory has changed. Germany's window of overwhelming advantage is closing, and Stalin's Soviet Union, bloodied but learning, is beginning its transformation into the force that will eventually take Berlin. In the Ural Mountains, 1,500 kilometers east of Moscow, Stalin's greatest achievement isn't happening on any battlefield. It's happening in hastily constructed factories, where workers labor 20 hours per day in unheated buildings, where engineers design weapons with frostbitten fingers, where an entire industrial system is being rebuilt from fragments while war rages in the West. The Soviet Union is evolving, not slowly, across generations, but rapidly, desperately, driven by survival pressure that either produces adaptation or extinction. Stalin himself works from morning until deep into the night, 7 days per week. He micromanages everything: production quotas, design specifications, resource allocation. His paranoia, which destroyed so much of the Soviet military in the purges, now drives a different kind of ruthlessness. Factory managers who fail to meet quotas are shot. Engineers who cannot solve problems are replaced. There is no tolerance for failure because failure means annihilation. But something else emerges too: innovation. Real innovation born from necessity. Soviet engineers dissect every captured German tank they can get their hands on. They measure armor thickness, test gun penetration, analyze engine reliability, examine track design. They're not just copying, they're learning principles, understanding why German designs work, then adapting those principles to Soviet conditions. The result is the 34. It's not the first Soviet tank, but it's the first that embodies everything Stalin's engineers have learned from studying Guderian's panzers. Sloped armor, 60 millimeters thick but angled at 30 degrees, meaning German shells hit at an oblique angle and bounce off instead of penetrating. A diesel engine less likely to catch fire when hit compared to German gasoline engines, and diesel fuel is less flammable. Wide tracks distributing weight so the tank doesn't sink into Russian mud the way narrower German tracks do. The gun is a 76mm cannon that can destroy any German tank at normal combat ranges. The armor is thick enough to resist German anti-tank weapons, and it's simple, deliberately, brilliantly simple. Crude even. Welds are rough. Interior is cramped and uncomfortable. No German engineer would accept such lack of refinement. But it's reliable, easy to repair with basic tools, can be manufactured quickly by semi-skilled workers in evacuated factories, and it works in Russian conditions: the cold, the mud, the vast distances. Production begins in late 1941. By spring 1942, hundreds roll off assembly lines monthly. By 1943, thousands. The Soviet Union will eventually produce over 50,000 34s, more than Germany produces of all tank types combined during the entire war. This is evolution through mass production, not individual superiority. German tanks often have better optics, better crew comfort, better mechanical sophistication. But evolution doesn't reward individual superiority, it rewards reproductive success. And the 34 reproduces faster than German factories can build tanks to destroy them. Stalin studies the Battle of Moscow obsessively, learning lessons that will shape Soviet military doctrine for decades. Defense in depth worked. Not perfectly Soviet casualties were still catastrophic, but it worked. Multiple defensive lines that absorbed the energy of German attacks, trading space for time. He orders construction of defensive belts across the entire front line. Not just trenches, but engineered killing zones. Anti-tank ditches too wide and steep for German tanks to cross, forcing them into predetermined routes. Dragon's teeth, pyramid-shaped concrete obstacles arranged in staggered rows, channeling armor into narrow corridors. Minefields, barbed wire, interlocking fields of fire. Soviet engineers calculate the physics of it. How many Dragon's teeth are needed to slow a panzer division by 1 hour? How deep must anti-tank ditches be to stop a Mark IV tank? How many mines per square kilometer to achieve 90% probability of disabling a vehicle? It's warfare as engineering problem, as mathematics. Stalin, who trusts numbers more than people, loves this. He can see defensive effectiveness expressed as equations, as measurable quantities. If German panzers advance at X kilometers per hour and defensive belt Y reduces speed by Z%, then you need W number of defensive belts to delay them long enough for reserves to arrive. The human cost the soldiers who must hold those defensive positions, while German tanks and aircraft and artillery hammer them, is part of the equation too. Stalin calculates acceptable casualty rates the way an engineer calculates acceptable stress on a bridge. Cold, precise, monstrous, but effective. Soviet military doctrine evolves at institutional level. New training emphasizes initiative at lower ranks. Junior officers are taught to think tactically, to adapt to battlefield conditions. It's a dangerous change. For Stalin, teaching initiative might create officers who question political authority, but the alternative is losing the war. So he accepts the risk, though he never entirely trusts military commanders and keeps political officers embedded in every unit to watch for disloyalty. The concept of shock armies emerges. These are Stalin's answer to panzer divisions, concentrated mobile forces designed for breakthrough and exploitation. They're not elegant. Soviet coordination isn't as precise as German. Radio discipline is looser. Plans are simpler, more rigid, but they work on Soviet terms. Instead of German precision and coordination, shock armies rely on mass and momentum. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of soldiers, overwhelming artillery support. They don't maneuver as gracefully as German panzer groups. They're blunter instruments, but they're easier for Soviet commanders to control, more forgiving of mistakes, more aligned with Soviet strengths. Think of it as parallel evolution. Guderian's panzers and Soviet shock armies are both responses to the same problem: how to conduct mobile warfare in the modern age, but they've evolved different solutions based on different conditions. German solution emphasizes precision and coordination. Soviet solution emphasizes mass and resilience. Neither is objectively better. Each is optimized for its environment. The transformation extends beyond tanks and armies. Soviet partisans, irregular fighters, operating behind German lines, evolve into strategic weapons. Initially, partisan activity is disorganized, desperate. Isolated soldiers who escaped encirclement, local civilians resisting occupation, Communist Party members following Stalin's call to create unbearable conditions for the Germans. But Stalin systematically organizes this chaos. Radio operators parachute behind German lines to coordinate partisan groups. Supply drops provide weapons and explosives. Intelligence officers train partisan commanders in sabotage techniques. The partisans learn to attack German supply lines. Not the frontline troops, those are too well defended, but the long, vulnerable supply columns that must travel hundreds of kilometers through occupied territory to reach the front. A truck convoy destroyed here, a fuel depot burned there, a bridge demolished, railway tracks torn up. Individually, these are pinpricks. Collectively, they're poison in the German rear areas. Guderian's system requires reliable logistics. Fuel and ammunition must flow forward constantly. When partisans disrupt those supply lines, the panzers become immobile. The entire tactical advantage disappears. German forces respond with increasing brutality, executing civilians suspected of partisan sympathies, burning villages, creating terror. But terror breeds resistance. For every partisan killed, The harsh German occupation creates two more. It's an escalating cycle that drains German resources and attention. Soviet artillery undergoes revolution. Instead of trying to target individual German tanks, nearly impossible given the speeds involved, Soviet artillery commanders develop the concept of fire bags. They pre-register coordinates for killing zones. When German armor enters these zones, every gun in the sector fires simultaneously, saturating the mind. Area with shells. It's not precision fire, it's area saturation, wasteful by German efficiency standards. But the Soviet Union has artillery shells to waste, and a vast industrial capacity to produce more. Germany doesn't. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 through February 1943, becomes the testing ground where all these Soviet adaptations come together. German forces, including some of Guderian's tactical descendants, advance into the city expecting to take it quickly. Instead, they encounter a different kind of warfare. Urban combat negates many German advantages. Tanks can't maneuver freely in rubble-choked streets. Air support is less effective when enemy positions are inside buildings. Radio coordination is disrupted by dense construction. The fluid, mobile warfare that Guderian perfected becomes grinding, close-range battle where Soviet soldiers excel. Stalin orders the defense, not one step back. It's brutal, uncompromising, but it works. Soviet forces hold Stalingrad building by building, room by room, and while the Germans are locked in urban combat, Soviet forces execute a classic encirclement maneuver, exactly the kind Guderian pioneered, surrounding the entire German army in the city. When the German Sixth Army surrenders in February 1943, it's a strategic earthquake. 91,000 German soldiers march into Soviet captivity. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, mountains of equipment captured or destroyed. More importantly, it's proof. Proof that Soviet forces can outthink German tactical doctrine. Proof that Stalin's adaptations work. Proof that the predator can become prey. The final test comes at Kursk in July 1943. German forces, rebuilt and reinforced, plan a massive pincer attack against a Soviet salient, a bulge in the front lines. It's pure Guderian doctrine. Concentrate armor, achieve breakthrough, encircle and destroy Soviet forces before they can react. But Stalin knows the attack is coming. Soviet intelligence discovers the German plan weeks in advance. And Stalin prepares. 8 defensive belts, 300 kilometers deep, over 20,000 mines per square kilometer in some sectors, dragon's teeth and anti-tank ditches and artillery positions and dug-in tanks serving as stationary guns. The Germans attack on July 5th with 3,000 tanks, the largest armoured assault in history. They advance into prepared defences that absorb their strength like quicksand. Every kilometre costs time and tanks and men. The breakthrough never comes. After 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the Germans withdraw, their offensive power broken. Soviet forces immediately counterattack. They've learned. They don't wait for German forces to recover. They push forward while the enemy is off balance, using shock armies to exploit success, exactly as Guderian would. The Soviet Union is no longer just surviving, it's winning. The student has learned from the teacher, adapted those lessons to Soviet conditions, and created something new. Something that combines Guderian's mobile warfare concepts with Soviet mass and resilience. From this point forward, until Berlin falls in May 1945, Soviet forces advance almost continuously. German tactical skill remains formidable, but tactics cannot overcome strategic mathematics when the opponent has learned your system, adapted to counter it, and possesses greater resources. Evolution has run its course. The prey species that survived initial contact with a new predator has developed defenses, then offenses, and is now hunting the hunter. The cycle continues, but the advantage has shifted, and it will never shift back. April 7th, 2003. Baghdad, Iraq. American Moan Abrams tanks thunder through the heart of the city in broad daylight, racing down highways at 60 kilometers per hour, engaging Iraqi defenders, then pushing deeper into the urban landscape before resistance can organize. The operation is called a Thunder Run. It's pure Guderian. 70 years after he developed Blitzkrieg, American commanders are executing tactics that would be instantly recognizable to the Prussian general. Concentrate armor, move at maximum speed, penetrate deep into enemy rear areas, create chaos faster than the enemy can respond, maintain momentum absolutely. The commanders planning these operations have studied military history. They know the lineage of what they're doing. From Guderian's breakthrough at Sedan in 1940, through Soviet operations that liberated Eastern Europe in 1944 and 45, through Israeli tank warfare in the Sinai, through every successful armored campaign since, the principles remain constant even as technology evolves. Modern tanks have computers, thermal sights, GPS navigation, encrypted digital communications, but the tactical concepts are unchanged: speed, concentration, surprise, exploitation. The same ideas that Guderian sketched in notebooks while watching men die at Verdun. Consider what this means. Military tactical doctrine normally evolves slowly, across generations. The tactics of Roman legions took centuries to develop and centuries to become obsolete. Medieval cavalry warfare persisted for nearly 1,000 years before gunpowder changed the calculus. But Guderian's insights, forged in the horror of one world war and proven in another, remain relevant nearly a century later. They've transcended their specific technological moment, the tanks and radios and dive bombers of the 1930s, to become fundamental principles of how mobile warfare operates. In Russia, at the General Staff Academy in Moscow, officer candidates still study the Guderian-Stalin dynamic as a core part of military education. It's taught not as history, but as operational art. How innovation forces counter-innovation. How tactical genius must account for enemy. Adaptation. How the cycle of move and counter-move drives military evolution. The course examines specific battles. Guderian's breakthrough at Sedan is analyzed in exhaustive detail: every decision point, every risk taken, every moment where the operation could have failed. Then they study Stalin's defense of Moscow, looking at how defensive depth and winter conditions negated German advantages. The students, young Russian officers who will command forces in future conflicts, are taught to think in terms of action and reaction. What tactical innovation might enemies develop? How quickly can we adapt? What counter-innovations should we prepare? It's military evolution made conscious and deliberate. Declassified documents from Soviet archives, released after the Cold War ended, reveal something remarkable: Stalin's private notebooks from the war years. They survived despite his orders that all personal papers be destroyed after his death. Someone, perhaps understanding their historical importance, preserved them. The notebooks are filled with sketches, tank formations drawn in pencil, defensive positions marked with precise measurements, calculations of breakthrough velocities and defensive depth requirements, tables showing how many anti-tank guns per kilometer are needed to achieve various probability levels of stopping armored advances. But there are other entries too. Personal observations about Guderian specifically. He attacks where he is not expected, and when the enemy is unprepared, this is his genius. Another entry. Guderian understands that breakthrough is a process, not a destination. He never stops moving. And this, written in December 1941, just after Moscow was saved. I have learned from my enemy what my own generals could not teach me. It's an extraordinary admission from Stalin, a man famous for never acknowledging any form of weakness or debt to others. But in the privacy of his notebooks, he could be honest. Guderian had penetrated not just Soviet territory but Stalin's mind, had forced the Soviet dictator to think differently about warfare, about tactics, about the nature of military power. The relationship between them was never personal. They met only once, briefly, at that victory parade in Poland in September 1939, and likely didn't speak directly, but it was profound. Predator and prey, teacher and student, innovator and adapter. Modern military planners study their relationship because it illuminates fundamental truths about conflict. The tactical genius who develops revolutionary new methods, the defender who must adapt or perish, the cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that drives military evolution forward. This pattern repeats throughout history. Examine any major shift in military doctrine and you'll find the same dynamic. The Mongol horse archers who terrorized settled civilizations until those civilizations learned to build defenses and field their own mobile forces. The British longbowmen who dominated European battlefields until armor and tactics evolved to counter them. The submarine warfare that nearly strangled Britain in 2 world wars until convoy systems and depth charges and radar provided counters. Innovation creates advantage. Advantage creates pressure to adapt. Adaptation reduces advantage. New innovation emerges to restore advantage. The cycle continues endlessly. What makes the Guderian-Stalin dynamic special is how compressed it was. Not centuries or generations, but years. 5 years from Poland falling in weeks to Soviet forces advancing on Berlin. 5 years for prey to become predator. 5 years for an entire system of warfare to be developed, proven effective, countered, and superseded. The speed of that evolution tells us something important about modern warfare. Technology and industrial capacity matter, yes. But adaptability matters more. The side that learns faster, that adapts more successfully, that turns enemy innovations into opportunities for counter-innovation, that side eventually wins. Today's military theorists look at emerging technologies and wonder which will be the next blitzkrieg. Drone swarms that overwhelm air defenses through sheer numbers, cyber attacks that paralyze enemy command and control, hypersonic missiles that strike before defenders can react, artificial intelligence that controls weapon systems and makes decisions faster than human commanders. Each of these technologies promises revolutionary advantages. Each might be the next tactical system that conquers nations before they understand what's happening. But the Guderian-Stalin dynamic suggests that any advantage is temporary, that somewhere defensive planners are already thinking about counters, that the prey species is already beginning to adapt. The Americans who planned thunder runs through Baghdad studied not just Guderian successes, but Stalin's responses. They understood that speed and surprise create temporary windows of advantage. They knew those windows close as enemies adapt, so they struck quickly, exploited their advantage while it existed, achieved objectives before Iraqi forces could mount coordinated resistance. It worked. Baghdad fell in 3 weeks. The conventional military phase of the Iraq War was a stunning success. But then came the insurgency, an enemy that adapted, that developed tactics specifically to counter American strengths, roadside bombs instead of tank battles, hidden fighters instead of uniformed armies, exactly the kind of adaptation that the Guderian-Stalin dynamic predicts. Every advantage creates pressure for counter-adaptation. Every innovation spawns defensive responses. The cycle continues because it must, because warfare is, at its core, an evolutionary process. Species, or in this case, military doctrines that cannot adapt go extinct. Those that can survive and develop their own innovations. Guderian died in 1954, 9 years after the war ended. He wrote memoirs, advised the rebuilding West German military, and watched as NATO adopted the very tactics he had pioneered. His legacy was secure. He had revolutionized warfare as thoroughly as anyone in history. Stalin died in 1953, still ruling the Soviet Union he had defended so brutally and successfully. His legacy is far more complicated. The tens of millions killed by his policies cannot be separated from his wartime success. But his role in adapting to and ultimately defeating German tactical superiority cannot be denied. Neither man would have existed in history without the other. Guderian needed an opponent powerful enough to force him to prove his concepts at the grandest scale. Stalin needed an existential threat severe enough to force brutal adaptation. They created each other in a strange way, each becoming what they were through opposition to the other. And their legacy extends far beyond the Eastern Front of World War II. Every military academy in the world teaches their story. Every tank commander understands they're implementing concepts Guderian developed. Every defensive planner uses principles. Stalin's forces proved effective. The echo of their conflict reverberates through time. When Israeli tanks raced through the Sinai in 1967, covering ground that supposedly required weeks in less than a week, military analysts called it blitzkrieg in the desert. When Vietnamese defenders at Dien Bien Phu surrounded French forces using artillery hidden in jungle-covered hills, experts noted similarities to Soviet defensive doctrine. The fundamental patterns persist: innovation, advantage, adaptation, counter-innovation, forever and always, as long as human beings compete for survival and dominance. In Moscow's Central Armed Forces Museum, there's a display case containing artifacts from the Battle of Moscow, a German tank commander's map showing planned routes to the Kremlin, a Soviet anti-tank rifle that destroyed German armor, photographs of soldiers from both sides, young men frozen in time by war, and in a corner, almost easy to miss, two portraits hang side by side. Heinz Guderian in his Wehrmacht uniform, Joseph Stalin in his Generalissimo's coat, the predator and the prey, the innovator and the adapter, teacher and student, enemies who created each other and, in doing so, created the template for how modern warfare evolves. Their story continues. In every military innovation today, in every defensive adaptation, in every cycle of advantage and counter-advantage, the specifics change: new technologies, new battlefields, new nations, but the pattern remains. The pattern they discovered, proved, and left as legacy to all future generations who must understand war, to prepare for it, prevent it, or if necessary, survive it. There's a fundamental truth about conflict that Guderian and Stalin illuminated more clearly than anyone before or since. It's not about good versus evil. It's not about democracy versus tyranny. It's not even really about victory or defeat in any final sense. It's about the endless dance between innovation and adaptation, between the predator developing new hunting techniques and the prey evolving new defenses, between breakthrough and counter-breakthrough, between genius and the desperate ingenuity that genius forces into existence. This dance has no ending. It cannot end, not as long as competition exists, not as long as survival depends on being better than your opponents at the fundamental task of organized violence. Consider what happened after their duel ended. The Cold War emerged almost immediately. The Soviet Union, having learned so much from defending against Germany, applied those lessons to building the largest conventional military force in history. Tens of thousands of tanks, millions of soldiers, tactical doctrine that combined Guderian's mobility concepts with Soviet mass and defensive depth. NATO responded by developing new technologies and tactics, precision-guided munitions that could destroy tanks from beyond visual range, attack helicopters that hunted armor from the air, eventually, stealth technology that rendered defensive systems blind. Each innovation spawned counter-innovations: better tank armor, more sophisticated air defenses, electronic warfare systems. The arms race spiraled upward, consuming trillions of dollars, driving technological advancement at a pace never seen in peacetime. All because Guderian showed that revolutionary tactical advantages were possible, and Stalin proved that such advantages could be countered through adaptation and innovation. Neither side went to war. The potential cost was too high, but they prepared constantly, each watching the other, each developing new capabilities and counters to enemy capabilities. The Guderian-Stalin dynamic made conscious and deliberate, playing out across decades instead of years. Today, the same pattern continues with new players and new technologies. China develops anti-ship ballistic missiles designed to destroy American aircraft carriers. America responds with new carrier defense systems and shifts to distributed naval formations less vulnerable to concentrated attack. Russia develops hypersonic missiles. NATO develops detection and interception systems. Back and forth, action and reaction, innovation and counter-innovation. Cyber warfare represents a new front in this eternal struggle. Attack techniques evolve daily. Defensive measures adapt constantly. A vulnerability discovered today might be patched tomorrow. A penetration method that works this week becomes useless next week. The cycle accelerates because digital evolution operates faster than physical manufacturing. But the underlying pattern remains identical to what Guderian and Stalin taught. Find an advantage. Exploit it while it exists. Force your enemy to adapt. Adapt yourself to their adaptations. Never stop. Evolving because stopping means extinction. Artificial intelligence promises to accelerate this cycle even further. Imagine weapon systems that learn from every engagement, that adapt their tactics in real time based on enemy responses, that evolve strategies faster than human commanders can comprehend. The first military to field truly effective AI-controlled weapons might achieve an advantage as revolutionary as Blitzkrieg was in 1939. But if the Guderian-Stalin dynamic teaches us anything, it's that such advantages are temporary. Somewhere, defensive AI systems are being developed, counter-tactics are being designed. The adaptation will come, driven by the same survival pressure that drove Stalin to transform Soviet military doctrine in the midst of existential crisis. This might seem pessimistic, an endless arms race with no winner, just temporary advantages that eventually get countered. Innovation that spawns counter-innovation forever, consuming resources and attention that might be directed toward more constructive purposes. But there's another way to understand it. This cycle has driven much of human technological progress. The pressure to develop better weapons has produced better engines, better materials, better communications, better computers. The military innovations eventually diffuse into civilian applications. The Internet began as a military project. GPS was developed for guiding missiles. Jet engines were refined for fighter aircraft. The Guderian-Stalin dynamic, played out across all of human history, has been one of the primary engines of technological advancement. Not the only one. Human curiosity and the desire to improve life quality matter enormously, but a significant one. The pressure of competition, the need to adapt or perish, accelerates innovation in ways that peaceful contemplation rarely matches. And consider what their story teaches about human potential. Guderian, watching pointless slaughter at Verdun, he refused to accept that warfare must continue that way. He imagined something better, faster, more decisive, less destructive of human life in the aggregate, even if more terrifying in execution. Then, he made his vision real through persistence and calculation, and refusing to accept conventional wisdom. Stalin, facing invasion by a force using tactics he didn't understand, could have collapsed. The Soviet Union could have fallen, as France fell, as Poland fell. Instead, through brutal determination and systematic study of his enemy, he adapted, he learned, he transformed weakness into strength and eventually victory. Both men were monsters in their own ways. Guderian served an evil regime and knew it. Stalin killed tens of millions through deliberate policy. Neither deserves moral admiration, but their intellectual achievements, their demonstrations of what human minds can accomplish under extreme pressure, remain instructive. They show that no advantage is permanent, that adaptation is always possible, that the species, or doctrine, or nation that seems invincible today can be countered tomorrow by those desperate enough to learn and adapt. This should be simultaneously humbling and encouraging. Humbling because it means our current superiority, whatever form it takes, is temporary. Encouraging because it means our current disadvantages can be overcome through study and innovation and systematic adaptation. The cycle continues today in ways both obvious and subtle. Every military staff college studies Guderian and Stalin. Every defense contractor develops weapons with counters already in mind. Every strategic planner assumes that today's advantages will be tomorrow's neutralized capabilities, so constant innovation is essential. But the cycle extends beyond military matters. Businesses compete through innovation and adaptation. Technologies emerge and spawn counter-technologies. Social movements provoke counter-movements. The pattern Guderian and Stalin made, visible in the starkest possible terms, through industrial warfare, consuming millions of lives, actually describes something more fundamental about competitive human systems. Someone, somewhere, is developing the next blitzkrieg, not necessarily military, perhaps economic, a new business model that disrupts entire industries before they can adapt. Perhaps technological quantum computing or fusion power or something we can't yet imagine that makes current approaches obsolete. Perhaps social or political. And someone else, somewhere, is already beginning to think about counters, how to defend against innovations they can't yet fully define, how to adapt quickly enough that overwhelming advantage never develops, how to survive first contact with revolutionary change and live to develop effective responses. This is the legacy of Guderian and Stalin. Not just their specific tactical innovations, though those remain important, but the larger truth they illuminated, that human competition drives an endless cycle of innovation and adaptation, that genius forces counter-genius, that predator creates smarter prey, which becomes new predator. The arms race is eternal because competition is eternal, because survival depends on staying ahead or catching up, because the alternative to continuing the race is accepting defeat, which humans and human institutions will not do as long as options remain. We might wish it otherwise. We might prefer a world where innovation serves only constructive purposes, where competition doesn't drive military advancement, where Guderian's genius could have been applied to peaceful engineering, and Stalin's brutal determination could have built rather than destroyed. But wishes don't change fundamental patterns. The dance between innovation and adaptation, between breakthrough and counter-breakthrough, between the revolutionary tactician and the desperate defender forced to become revolutionary themselves, this dance continues. It must continue. It will continue as long as humans compete for resources, security, and survival. And so, the story of Guderian and Stalin, teacher and student, predator and prey, genius and the genius that genius created, echoes forward through time, in every military academy, in every defense laboratory, in every strategic plan that assumes today's advantages are temporary and tomorrow's challenges will require innovations we haven't yet conceived. Their duel ended in 1945 when Soviet forces took Berlin and the Third Reich collapsed. But their legacy, the pattern they revealed, the cycle they exemplified, the truth they demonstrated about how human conflict drives evolutionary change, that legacy is eternal. Somewhere today, a young officer studies their campaigns and sees possibilities. Somewhere, an engineer designs weapons they hope will provide decisive advantage. Somewhere, a strategist calculates how to counter innovations that don't yet exist. The cycle continues, the arms race accelerates, the dance goes on, and it will continue, forever and always, because Guderian and Stalin taught us the fundamental truth. In the realm of human conflict, the only constant is change. The only permanent advantage is the capacity to adapt. The only way to survive is to keep evolving, keep learning, keep innovating faster than your opponents can counter. This is their gift to history. Not the specific tactics or weapons or doctrines. Those are details that change with technology. But the understanding that conflict is evolutionary pressure made manifest. That survival belongs to those who adapt most successfully. That genius creates counter-genius in an endless cycle that drives progress forward, for better and worse, forever. The predator and the prey, the innovator and the adapter, the teacher and the student who surpass the teacher. Their story is humanity's story, written large in blood and steel across the steppes of Russia, and it continues, in different forms with different actors, but following the same eternal pattern they made visible to all who have eyes to see and wisdom to understand.